And welcome again to another presentation of the Humanities 231 class. I am your instructor, Professor Barry Graham. Our discussion today will be concerning Chapter 3, Classical Greece and the Hellenistic Period. We'll note that we'll be talking about today the classical ideal. The classical period starts around 479 BCE. There's a reason for that exact date. This is during the time of the great Greek ruler Pericles. More to come concerning him. But you'll recall from our previous discussions that the Greeks during this time are on top of the world. They have defeated the Persians. They are now the world power, and they become the pioneers in every significant area of life. And so we want to look at these contributions today. As in most societies, they want cosmos rather than chaos. So there's a search for order and control. The Greeks always sought the golden mean. That is to say, they wanted to try to find that elusive middle ground in which they fulfilled their own responsibilities, and they had a certain civic pride in themselves and, of course, in their culture, the polis, as we've talked about. But they wanted to avoid hubris. Hubris was that idea that you thought a little too highly of yourself. In fact, at that point, you had gotten into that area reserved for the gods. And in many of these Greek stories, and especially in their drama that we'll look at, we'll see that it doesn't turn out well for those who engage in too much hubris. Nothing too much. Moderation is what they're going for here. Again, that elusive middle ground there. So you don't eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, because you might not die tomorrow. So the Greeks very much prize the value of human potential and their own capability, their abilities to be able to accomplish great things. We've talked about the great Greek city-states. We want to focus once again on Athens, which becomes the real capital of their intellectual achievements. It's the exemplar of human achievement among the Greeks. And so when the Persians are defeated there's that date again, 479 BCE, the Athenians are the dominant city-state during this time of roughly 479 to 404 BCE. And they had a number of great accomplishments, not the least of which was, of course, a concept of democracy, rule by the people. So there was a democratic government in which they called the ecclesia, the boule, and the magistracies. You'll note this word here, ecclesia. We get our word church from this. Again, you'll recall that the New Testament was written in the Koine Greek, the common Greek of the day, and this was the assembly of people, and so something like we would call our Senate or our House of Representatives. We need to remember, though, when we're talking about democracy here in Greek, that it has to be qualified. This is not democracy for all people. There's over 200,000 slaves here in this city, and so the vast majority of people don't get to participate in the government. If you were a free Greek male, then of course it was a democracy. But if you were a slave, a woman, or a child, this was definitely not the case. But it is a beginning of what we would call democracy. The Delian League on this island of Delos that we've talked about before takes a major part in this. And of course, during the Peloponnesian War, this war between the city-states in 431 to 404 BC, there was much infighting, and out of this does arise the great Greek ruler Pericles, and he ushers in what we refer to today as their golden age. There's many cultural developments with the various sculptors that Pericles will be the great patron of the arts and support them, Phidias and Myron. Also during this time there's the development of the great playwrights in these Greek dramatic works. And in architecture, the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and many of the others that we'll be looking at here. Here is a bust of Pericles, and again, it's always interesting the way they depict these Greek rulers, or rulers in any culture. Normally they'll depict them as warriors. They want to be portrayed in that way because that's what gives the people a certain amount of security. So he's got the helmet and the very serene look on the face, and we've noted before how common this is. We mentioned the great tragic playwrights of Greece. There were festivals. Besides the competitions in the Olympic Games, there were festivals on a regular basis. One of these was the festivals to the god Dionysus. In these theaters, and there was a theater built in every major Greek city. We need to recognize that twice in history we've seen theater grow out of religious ritual. In the beginning here in ancient Grecian times, the idea of acting things out grew out of their need to participate in certain religious rituals. We see it again in the Middle Ages in what grows out of what's called the Eucharist, what we would call the Lord's Supper, and modern-day drama grows out of that. There was a structure to the way that these writers wrote their tragedies. It was a trilogy, and we're used to thinking of that today with movies. Movies are normally made in trilogies like the original Star Wars and the Godfather movies. There were 3 tragedies and then a satyr play, which was more tongue-in-cheek, more comedy. We get our term satire from that. And there were plots. There were, of course, actors and props. And there was a chorus, which we shouldn't mistake that with the idea of a musical chorus that we're used to thinking of today. This was a body of people who were used to communicate things and some of the plots within the plays and carrying on conversation with the actors. So this was a different type of dramatic presentation than what we might think of today. The great Athenian tragic dramaticists were Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. We mentioned that all of the great Greek cities had these very large theaters. This is the one at Epidaurus. It's still there today, what's left of it. And here you can see this central stage area here that formulates the area where the chorus would be. This would be called the pit. We call it a pit orchestra today because that's where you would put the orchestra. But this is where the chorus would be in many cases. And then back here, I referred to this as the stage. Actually, it would be back here. And underneath the stage would be an elaborate series of tunnels and things of that nature that they could use to transport the props. So it was a very, very elaborate system that the Greeks had devised to enact these various plays. Notice how it's built into a hill, so it forms a natural amphitheater. You can see the surrounding hillsides here. And so this is theater seating like you're used to seeing in movie theaters today. And the acoustics were better this way. You'll recall they didn't have any PA systems or microphones or anything like that. And this would seat roughly 17,000 or so if memory serves. The first of the great Greek writers of tragedy was Aeschylus. He was very optimistic in his philosophy and themes, and as we mentioned earlier, it's no wonder that this was the case. The Greeks were on top of the world. They were the world power. They had defeated the Persians, and they're feeling very good about themselves. And his trilogy was called the Aristia. It was composed of 3 plays: Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Humanities. And he explored themes such as the growth of civilization through reason and order. Sophocles comes next. Sophocles was actually a friend of this ruler, Pericles, so small wonder that he did receive patronage from Pericles. And he writes about the consequences of human error. And mostly traditionally religious in the themes. Again, religion is one of the things that holds these cultures together, even as it does many people today. And he's best known for Antigone and Oedipus the king. We still use the expression in psychology today, the Oedipus complex, when someone has a close relationship with a parent of the opposite sex, not so much with a parent of the same sex. And this is because in this really convoluted plot that we find in Oedipus the king, or sometimes known as Oedipus Rex in the Latin, he ends up killing his father and marrying his mother, though he does this without actually knowing it. Euripides will be the next playwright. Euripides emphasizes realistic themes, a real emphasis on rational thinking, social, political, and religious injustice. He has a social conscience. He's got a concern for psychological truth, for the way people think. And so we see these themes in his plays, such as the suppliant women, Helen, the Bacchae, the Phryginia of Taurus. And then Aristophanes. He's actually more of a comic writer, more comedies than tragedies, and so he's very involved in the writing of political satire and fantasy, and in such works as The Birds and Lysistrata. Lysistrata is particularly interesting.
I must content myself with this. Get up here, man. Get up! Up. Men, this is the face of your enemy. Know it well. For if you let it get the slightest hold over you, it's the end. Its audacity will know no bounds. And we shall soon see them building ships and fighting sea fights like Artemis. And if they should ever decide to ride as cavalry, well, then I had best cashier your horse, for women excel at riding. Oh, yes, they like nothing more than to establish a firm seat. And once they do, they will always ride on top. Think also of all those squadrons of Amazons painted for us by Mycon at the portico. Yes, Amazons engaged in hand-to-hand combat with men. Yes, and remember also Theseus, the king Theseus, who was almost brought to his knees by the Amazon queen. Now then I ask you, will you submit? No! Then make like Ares, to war! Stab her in the heart!
By the two goddesses, forgive me!
No. Like this. I tell you, man, if it does not soon become normal for you to make war against woman, it's the end. And you will soon be good for nothing but this slave's collar. Attack! That's right! Let sweet victory be your mistress!
As mentioned, a really interesting play. This is during the Peloponnesian Wars, the wars between the city-states, specifically Athens and Sparta. And the women have told them, hey guys, no more sex until you negotiate a treaty. So, seems like kind of a modern idea, but there it is in ancient times. The age of Pericles, as well as the great age of Athens, of course, comes to an end. And then the primary ruler of the years following this time revolve around the great ruler Philip of Macedon. You may remember from your New Testament studies the Macedonian call during Paul's missionary journey. This was, of course, many, many years before that. The Macedonian Empire is in place during this time. Another huge political event was the League of Corinth. And of course, Corinth, we've talked about being a major player during this time as well. And this eventually culminates in Greece becoming a world empire under Alexander the Great. He achieves much of this fame when he's, of course, a young man. There's the probably legend of him laying down and crying one night because there was no more of the world left to conquer. But it's during this time in Alexander the Great that we do see the birth of the Koine Greek language, in which the New Testament's written, as we talked about. As he brought soldiers together from all over the empire, there was a tendency to, for lack of a better word, kind of dumb the language down, and so it became much more explicit because of the need of these soldiers to be able to speak to each other. So they focused in on primarily the key words, and that's how the Koine Greek language actually came about. It was only there in place for about 600 years, about 300 years before Christ and about 300 years after Christ, and then it disappears just as it came in. Philosophy during the late classical period is among the most mature and great periods of philosophy in the history of the world. This begins with Socrates. We don't really have any of the original writings of Socrates remaining. What we have left is from his pupil, Plato, and from others that were his pupils, but primarily from Plato. Socrates was another one of these teachers that would take young Greek men into his care, and education was primarily for the Greek males during this period in history. Socrates would talk about such things as the fate of the individual. He questioned traditional values. This got him in a lot of trouble with the more traditional or conservative element in his culture. He also got in trouble with the liberals because he tended to question everything. And so when we talk about Socratic questioning or the Socratic problem, we're really determining how much of later writings reflect him accurately. As we say, there's just no original writings left, so we really don't know. But the main thing is that we still use the Socratic questioning method in law schools even to this day. The idea of continuing to ask questions until you get to the core of things. Another great philosopher, Xenophon. Xenophon was also a Greek historian, and his works concerning Socrates are interesting, but they tend to be very superficial. So this is another source for the writings of Socrates. Xenophon's primary writings were the Apology, the Symposium, and the Memorabilia. One of the greatest philosophers of all time, Plato, the pupil of Socrates. Plato is known for his writings, much of which survives, which is unusual for writings of antiquity. His Apology, his Crito, his Phaedo. Remember that apology doesn't mean that he's saying he's sorry. In the Greek, apology means defense. That's why when we talk about such things as, say, Christian apologetics, there's books on Christian apologetics. That's not somebody apologizing to be a Christian. That's somebody giving a defense of the Christian faith. And this was pioneered among the Greeks. Plato's school was called the Academy. All of these teachers would found certain schools, and again they would take enrollment from these young Greek males. And so one of the reasons why we call a school an academy to this day is for this very reason. We should also make a couple of comments about these things that you see on the screen that I mentioned previously. The Crito was actually set in a prison. It's an explanation or a defense of why Socrates refuses to escape from prison. And it comes down to the idea of the polis. As we talked about, this community was one of the most important, if not the most important thing among the Greeks. And so even though Socrates was offered exile instead of the death penalty, drinking the poison, the hemlock as they called it, he chose to drink the hemlock because he couldn't imagine life without the polis, without the Greek community. And so this Crito is set in prison while he contemplates these things. The Phaedo were the last days of Socrates' life, and it's a discussion actually of the afterlife. And it's very interesting to get a little insight into Greek philosophy regarding the afterlife. Very different from the Christian or the Jewish view of things. In political theory, Plato proposed the idea of the ideal society, what we would call today a utopia, even though they didn't use that word during that particular time of history. And so he wrote a number of works dealing with this idea of the ideal state. This work was called The Republic. His theory of forms, on the other hand, had to do with how our lives should be organized within that ideal society. Everyone has their purpose. It was a caste system. It wasn't nearly as advanced as we might think of ourselves being today. We find the idea repugnant of a caste society or pigeonholing people in terms of just what they can do, and there's really no upward movement in that. But they had the philosopher kings, they had the soldiers, they had the workers. And so naturally, they had the philosopher kings because Plato was a philosopher, so not hard to justify how he would be able to come to that. These works were inspired by the chaos of 4th century Greek politics. Remember, there's upheaval during this time. This is post-Athens. Not that Athens has disappeared, but this is post that time where Athens is the dominant force in that culture. And so it's not hard to see why these kinds of things would be popular in the writings of that day. We want to flash forward here to a painting by Raphael that was done many, many years later in the Renaissance. The reason we want to do it is this is a painting called The School of Athens. And it's a remarkable painting, not least of which because it shows us how, as we've talked about before, the artist is a person of not only great skill, but of great sensitivity. In the middle here, among all of the activity, and we remember that life in ancient Greece was mainly out of doors, and so we had these open structures and things of this nature. As we look here in the middle, we see the two great Greek philosophers, Plato on the left, and on the right, his pupil, Aristotle. And as happens sometimes, the pupil disagrees with the teacher. And the artist brings this out here in a remarkable way because what we can see is Plato is pointing upward and Aristotle is motioning downward. Now this is remarkable because it's a great summary of how they conceive of the nature of reality. You see, in Plato's thinking, everything was about universals. That was what made things make sense. Things are the most real when they're in your mind. Think about, you got a dream about your ideal house. If you attempt to build that ideal house, it never comes out exactly as you conceive in your mind because there might be an issue with local code or you may run out of money to do everything the way you wanted it. There are many factors that enter in that might prevent you from getting it exactly the way you conceived it. And so Plato would say, when was it really your ideal home? It was your ideal home when it was in your mind. Now, Aristotle, on the right there, disagrees. He motions downward and says, no, it's not about universals, it's about particulars. It's about what you can see and hear and taste and feel and smell. That's reality. The home that you actually end up with is what's real. What's in your mind was just what's in your mind. Aristotle has been very influential on Western culture. As you can see, it was Aristotle that really won in this war of ideas, if you want to call it that. Even today, people consider material things much more real than, let's say, spiritual or immaterial things. If I had opened this presentation today and said, I'll give every student in my class a choice, I'll either give you wisdom or I'll give you $1 billion. Which one would you choose? Well, probably like a true citizen of Western culture, you would take the $1 billion. But why? Why would you treasure money over wisdom? Now, you might be thinking, with $1 billion, I can buy a lot of wisdom. Well, that's the way we've come to think of material things, especially in terms of their importance. We mentioned Aristotle, the pupil of the great Plato. His school, rather than called the Academy, was called the Lyceum. There is this debate, Platonist versus Aristotelian, that I've just described when we were looking at the previous painting. We're talking about the nature of reality, the nature of God. The Greeks believed in a supreme being. It was a different conception than what we might have in a Judeo-Christian sense, but it was there nonetheless. And so things like metaphysics, a term we still use today, something beyond physics, beyond the physical, physics, rhetoric, the science of speaking and using words, poetics, these were all works by Aristotle. The greatest compliment that people have paid Aristotle is he's referred to as the master of those who know. He had a huge influence on early Christianity, and I think that's why it's as dominant in Western culture as it is. If Plato had been more influential, who knows what our priorities might be. It was Dante that actually called Aristotle the master of those who know. His influence on Western culture, as we mentioned, is seldom equaled. Music in the classical period was very evident in the popularity of instrumental music. We have very little in the way of written musical notation for Greek music. What survives is what's on tombstones, interestingly enough, but what much was written about the importance of music among the Greeks. In fact, they held that it was the single most important thing in the education of the young Greek male. They called it the doctrine of ethos. It was taught by both Plato and Aristotle, even though they both put their particular slant on it. And in the doctrine of ethos, we had the idea that the type of music that you listen to would have an effect on your ethical behavior. Listen to the right kind of music, you'll grow up to be a good citizen. Listen to the wrong kind of music, you'll grow up to be a delinquent. So kind of a debate that we still have today. But they base this on certain scales and modes, as we referred to earlier. Let's now listen to an example of what we think Greek music might have sounded like. And then, of course, the Pythagorean principles. Pythagoras, you'll know him from your math classes, the Pythagorean theorem and these kinds of things. But many people don't know that Pythagoras was also the father of music theory, the actual study of the tonalities. And it was Pythagoras who first discovered the idea that if you stretched out a chord and plucked it, by varying it or pushing it down at certain points along that string, as you would do today on a guitar or an instrument like that, violin, viola, cello, you can get different octaves and various musical intervals that we would refer to like a fourth, and the idea of basic scales like the tetrachord, and then scales that they would call modes. Rhythmic instrumentation was also important, as well as a basic type of musical notation. Now, we didn't come up with our modern style of musical notation until many, many years later, somewhere around 1100 AD. A monk by the name of Guido d'Arezzo came up with that in its most basic form. But they had their own as well. It is interesting. And they also borrowed a certain amount of their musical knowledge from an earlier civilization called the Phoenicians. They borrowed certain parts of the alphabet from them. The Phoenicians were pioneers in a lot of those areas, and very interesting people, and it's a shame we can't spend more time on them. We're continuing on with sculpture and vase painting during the 5th century. More and more an emphasis on naturalism and realism. We see that in Myron's The Discus Thrower. There's a new standard of human beauty that tends to change over the years. There's proportion, symmetry, and balance. We see that in a work like the Ricci bronzes, the bronze statues. Polykleitos of Argos wrote a book called The Canon and had a work called The Canon. Canon means standard in the Greek, and so this became the standard by which other sculptors would model their works. There's a focus on the individual, the emotional responses that people make, again, kind of a psychological study. And because of the times and the great conflicts that were going on, death and mourning. We need to remember that ancient cultures dealt with death a lot more than we do. We're very sanitized in our culture. We have embalming processes that make people look good even when they're dead. In fact, people will say sometimes at funerals, you know, she looks so natural. And they didn't have these things back then. They dealt with death on an everyday basis. Most babies died in childbirth or very young. It was unusual if you lived past 40 during this time on average. So no wonder that there would be an emphasis on that. And so we'll just look at a few of those works. There's Myron's work that we mentioned earlier, The Discus Thrower. Again, we can see the defined muscles and the sense of motion that comes into play. One of the Ricci bronze statues here, again, one of the few that remain from ancient Greek times. The vase paintings that we made mention of earlier, and the scenes from everyday life, what's sometimes called genre scenes. And then we don't want to forget architecture. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia was a monumental work. This was built after the Persian War, and there's proportion and interrelationships in this structure, and it exemplifies this idea of divine justice. This is the Temple of Zeus, and the Greeks pioneered this. The trial by jury, many of the things that we take for granted today begin with them. Probably the most impressive city was the Acropolis in Athens. This is where Paul was in Acts 17 when they call it Mars Hill, but it was actually the Acropolis there. This came about because of Pericles' building program and funding that with public monies, also monies from the Delian League. The great architect Phidias was the major player here, and the buildings are well known, some partially standing even today, such as the Parthenon with its proportion and balance, ideal beauty and realistic terms, and then just a couple of others that we'll go through quickly here. The Erechtheum is interesting because of the porch of the maidens, what they call caryatids, and we'll take a look at those in just a moment. The Parthenon, just a majestic structure The columns so massive, we can only imagine what it looked like in a pristine state. It was dedicated to the Greek goddess Athena, whom the people of Athens considered their great patron, of course, a patron goddess. Construction began in about 447 BC, was completed in around 438 BC, although they continued working on the decorations for about 6 years after that. It is the most important surviving building of classical Greece, and so we are fortunate that it's still among us even today. This is the Porch of the Maidens that we mentioned a while ago, and it turned out that this was a technique that was not followed much after the construction, and you can see why. It actually gives you a headache just to look at it, the idea that this structure is supported on the heads of these young women. Just the whole psychological effect on it, I think, was probably negative over a period of time. The visual arts during this period emphasized realism and emotion, the fate of the individual. This comes from the writings of Plato especially. Praxiteles emphasized the female body as an object of beauty, again a common art theme all throughout history. Scopus, emotion and intensity, and Lysippus, portraiture and style, the idea of doing portraits of individuals, very, very strong there. Here's one of the great works, the Apoxyomenos. Again, you can see the support there on his right leg here, and the arms still in good shape here. This is more than likely, if memory serves, a Roman copy of this Greek work. The interesting thing about it, Apoxyomenos means the scraper. We mentioned that athletes competed in the nude so that the judges could judge form as well as just simply who comes in first in the race or that sort of thing. And the reason it's called the scraper is that this is just showing a scene from everyday life among athletes. They would take a blunt instrument and scrape the sweat and dirt off their body. So once again, they would look better for the judges. So it was called a strigil, this blunt instrument that we're talking about, and this gives us some really interesting insight into something that they did during that period of history. Here's one of the temples, the Phalos Theodorus of Phocia. This was a sacred precinct at Delphi. We talked about the oracle at Delphi here, dedicated to either Athena or one of the other Athenas that was before the temple. There's debate about which one that it actually was. This is a site that's been revered since even before the ancient Greeks with the Mycenaeans. And so there were many clay figurines of women and fine sculpture that were admired there and can be admired to this day in the Delphi Museum. And then the Hellenistic period. The Greeks referred to themselves as Hellenes, a people that partook of a common culture and a common language and a common religion and a common outlook on life. It's during this time we see the division of the Macedonian Empire. Philip ends up dividing it among his sons, and so the lands of Syria, Egypt, Pergamum, and Macedonia, there was a spread of Greek influence all over the known world at that time. This is why the Koine Greek became a popular and a common language among the people. Artistic freedom versus the classical order. There was pressure for the artists to conform to a more provincial, traditional style, but as we know, the artists are always trying to push the envelope. So this is going on as well as new patrons arise to support some of these new artists. We see this conflict, as it were. We see it in works like the Altar of Zeus and the Laocoon. And then finally, the pendulum kind of swings back and there's a return to more classical principles. We see here in the map the Hellenistic world, the world empire. As far as many people were concerned, this was the entire world back during this time, or at least anything that was important. Before we conclude today, we want to look at some of the works that were mentioned earlier, the Laocoon. We're beginning to see a development in art here that will extend all the way into the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, very, very influential. This idea of the human body being twisted and elongated. Later, this will be called mannerism, but we see the early beginnings of it right here, of the idea of the more elongated body. And that will conclude our presentation today.